I've spent years perfecting recipes, turning ingredients into something special. But my stepfather, he laughed it off, said cooking was just messing around in the kitchen while he bragged about my sister's fancy job. At her wedding, he didn't just ignore me, he handed me a pile of dirty plates, sneering, "Keep busy, kid." Right there with everyone watching, he tried to make me feel worthless. What he didn't expect was me turning his plan upside down, creating something that shut him up and left the whole room speechless. Ever been humiliated, but turned it around? Share your story below. Like and subscribe to see how I made him regret it. I'm Ashley Miller, 24 years old, and I've been hooked on cooking since I was a kid, sneaking extra spices into my mom's meatloaf. Growing up in Columbus, Ohio, I'd spend hours mixing ingredients, testing recipes that made my dad's eyes light up before he passed away when I was 10. Cooking wasn't just a hobby, it was how I kept his memory alive. But after Mom married Frank Sullivan, my stepfather, everything changed. He didn't see my passion. He saw a kid wasting time while he bragged about my sister Brittany's real career as an accountant. To him, I was just the screw-up who'd never measure up. Frank came into our lives when I was 12, a loud-talking sales manager who thought he could fix our broken family. He'd strut around our split-level house in the suburbs, always in a cheap suit, acting like he owned the place. Mom Diane fell hard for his take-charge attitude, but I saw through it. He wasn't family. He was a bully who loved control. Brittany, my older sister, she's 27 now, ate it up. She'd been Mom's golden girl before Frank, and he just dialed it up. With her straight-A report cards and later her corner office job, Brittany could do no wrong. Frank would beam at her over dinner, saying things like, "You're going places, kid," while I sat there pushing peas around my plate invisible. It wasn't always like that. When I was little, Dad would let me help in the kitchen, stirring pancake batter or sneaking bites of cookie dough. He'd say, "Ash, you've got a gift. Don't let anyone tell you different." After he died, I held on to cooking like a lifeline. By high school, I was teaching myself techniques from YouTube, sous vide reductions, the works. I'd bring dishes to potlucks, spicy shrimp tacos, or lavender-infused cupcakes, and people raved. My culinary arts teacher, Mrs. Larson, even said I could go pro if I kept at it. She got me a part-time gig catering small events, birthday parties, book clubs. It wasn't much, maybe $50 a pop, but it felt like proof I wasn't wasting my time. Frank didn't care. He'd roll his eyes when I talked about recipes, calling it playing house and telling me to focus on something practical like Brittany's accounting degree. Mom stayed quiet, too afraid to rock the boat with her new husband. Once I made a 3-course meal for her birthday: roasted chicken with herb sauce, garlic mashed potatoes, and a chocolate tart. Frank took one bite, shrugged, and said, "Not bad for a kid's project." Brittany got a promotion that week, so the whole night turned into a toast to her. My meal barely mentioned. That was the pattern. Brittany shone, and I faded into the background. Things got worse when Brittany got engaged to Greg Harper, a software engineer with a nice smile and a steady job. They met at some networking event, Brittany's world, not mine, and hit it off. Greg was all right. He'd chat with me about food, sometimes even tried my chili once, and said it was killer. But Frank, he saw the engagement as his chance to play big shot. He threw himself into the wedding planning, pushing for a fancy venue at a Columbus country club, the kind of place with chandeliers and waiters in bow ties. He wanted to impress Greg's family, middle-class folks with a bit more polish than us. Mom backed him up, nodding along while Brittany picked out her dream dress. Me, I was an afterthought, barely invited to the planning sessions. I offered to help with the food, maybe pitch a dessert menu or work with the caterers. I'd catered a few events by then, small weddings even, so I knew I could handle it. Frank shut me down fast. "We're not serving your experiments, Ashley," he said, leaning back in his recliner like a king. "This is Brittany's day, not a place for your little foodie games." He handed me a list of chores instead: pick up tablecloths, double-check guest RSVPs, stuff like that. Mom just looked away, twisting her wedding ring. Brittany hesitated like she wanted to say something but stayed quiet. That's how it always went. Frank's word was final, and I was supposed to fall in line. The worst came a month before the wedding. We were at their house for dinner. Frank's grilled steaks tough as leather, and he laid out the wedding day rolls. Brittany and Greg got the spotlight, obviously bride and groom. Mom was in charge of flowers and keeping the aunts from bickering. Frank slid a clipboard across the table with that grin. I hated the one that said he had me cornered. "You're on cleanup crew," he said, tapping the paper. "Clear plates, keep the tables tidy during the reception." Useful stuff. I stared at him, feeling my chest tighten. Cleanup. "At my sister's wedding I could do food," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Maybe a signature dessert or help in the kitchen." Frank laughed, a short, mean sound. "Kitchen's for the pros, kid. You stick to the plates." Brittany shifted in her seat, looking at her napkin. Greg cleared his throat but didn't speak. Mom started stacking dishes, anything to avoid the moment. I wanted to scream to tell Frank he didn't get to decide my worth, but I just nodded. I'd learned long ago that arguing with him was like punching a brick wall. Still, it burned me up. I'd spent years building my skills, reading cookbooks late at night, saving for a decent chef's knife, working gigs to prove I was good. And now, he wanted me scraping leftovers while everyone toasted Brittany's perfect life. Later that night, I called my best friend Tina Brooks. She's 25, a bartender with a knack for saying what I need to hear. I told her about the plates, about Frank's smirk, and how small it made me feel. "He's a jerk, Ash," she said, her voice crackling through the phone. "But you're a damn good cook. Don't let him box you in." I laughed bitterly, saying, "What am I supposed to do? Sneak a cake into the wedding?" Tina got quiet, then said, "Maybe you should. Show them who you are." Her words stuck with me, planting a seed I couldn't shake. As the wedding got closer, I kept thinking about what Tina said. I wasn't just a kid with a hobby, I was a chef, even if Frank couldn't see it. But every time I saw him at family dinners or dropping off supplies for the wedding, his smug grin reminded me of my place. He'd pat Brittany's shoulder, saying, "This wedding's gonna be perfect thanks to my girl." Then he'd glance at me, adding, "Just keep those tables clear, Ashley." Each jab made the knot in my stomach tighter. I didn't know how or if I could fight back. All I knew was that wedding was coming, and with it a chance to be more than the girl with the dirty plates. The morning of Brittany's wedding dawned bright and crisp, perfect, for a day that was supposed to be all about her. I woke up with a pit in my stomach, not because of the wedding but because of what I'd been roped into. Frank's words from that dinner a month ago echoed in my head. "Clear plates, Ashley. Keep the tables tidy." I'd spent years honing my craft, perfecting recipes and catering gigs, but today I'd be a glorified busboy at my sister's big day. I pulled on the black slacks and white shirt Frank insisted I wear standard for the cleanup crew, and headed to the venue, a swanky country club on the outskirts of Columbus. The place was decked out, white roses everywhere, tables draped in linen, and a dance floor gleaming under chandeliers. Guests were already trickling in, Brittany's co-workers in sharp suits. Greg's family chatting by the bar. I spotted Mom fussing over the flower arrangements, her face tight with nerves, and Brittany in the bridal suite glowing in her lace gown. She caught my eye and waved, but before I could say anything, Frank appeared, his cheap cologne hitting me before his voice did. "Ashley, tables don't clear themselves," he said, smirking like he'd won something. "Don't dream of playing chef here, just do your job." His words landed like a punch, and I felt my face burn as a few guests glanced our way. I grabbed a tray and started collecting empty glasses, keeping my head down while Frank worked the room. He was in his element, slapping backs and laughing too loud, with Greg's dad acting like he'd paid for the whole thing. Every time I passed him, he'd toss out a jab, "Pick up the pace, kid," or "Don't make a mess." It wasn't just about the plates, he wanted everyone to see me as the help, not family. Brittany was busy with photos, smiling for the camera so she didn't notice. Mom saw but looked away, rearranging napkins like it was her life's mission. I kept moving, stacking dishes and biting my tongue, feeling smaller with every trip to the kitchen. By the time the ceremony started, I was stuck in the back watching Brittany glide down the aisle on Frank's arm. He was all puffed up, grinning like he'd raised her himself. Greg looked happy, and the crowd clapped when they kissed, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the stack of plates waiting for me at the reception. After the vows, guests headed to the banquet hall, chatting and sipping champagne while I slipped into the crowd to start clearing. The tables were a mess, half-eaten appetizers, spilled wine, and I felt eyes on me as I worked. A woman in a sparkly dress whispered to her friend, "Is she staff?" I wanted to disappear. Then Tina showed up, slipping through the guests in her bartender gear, her ponytail bouncing. She'd gotten a gig pouring drinks for the wedding, her way of crashing without crashing. She pulled me aside near the dessert table out of Frank's sight and handed me a soda. "You okay, Ash?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "You look like you're about to snap." I told her about Frank's comments, how he'd made sure everyone knew I was just the cleanup girl. "He's a piece of work," she said, shaking her head. "But you're not this Ash, you're a chef. Don't let him win." I shrugged, feeling the weight of the tray in my hands. What can I do? Serve a 5-course meal from the dish pit? Tina grinned, a spark in her eyes. Maybe not that, but don't count yourself out yet. Her words lingered as I went back to work, dodging guests and stacking plates. Around 6, as the reception kicked into gear, I overheard the catering manager in a panic near the kitchen. "The bakery screwed us," he hissed into his phone. "No wedding cake, nothing." "We're done for." My pulse spiked. No cake. For Brittany's wedding, I'd seen the order, a 3-tier vanilla with buttercream meant to be the centerpiece. Without it, the night would bomb and Frank would hear about it. I hesitated, then followed the manager, catching him by the kitchen entrance. "I can make a cake?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He stared, his tie crooked from stress. "You kid, we need a professional." I pushed back. "I've catered weddings, smaller ones. I know what I'm doing. Give me a shot." He wasn't convinced, but he was desperate, so he pointed to the kitchen. "You've got 2 hours. Don't screw this up." I nodded, my heart racing, and stepped inside. That's when Frank caught me, his face darkening as he blocked the door. "What the hell are you doing?" he snapped. "Get back to the tables." I stood my ground, gripping the counter behind me. "They need a cake, Frank. I can save this." He laughed, a cold, cutting sound. "You save Brittany's wedding, stick to the plates, Ashley. You're out of your league." His words stung, but they also lit a fire. I'd spent years taking his crap, shrinking to fit his idea of me. Not today. I turned to the manager, who was still on the phone, and said, "I'm doing this." He waved me in, too stressed to argue. Frank stormed off, muttering about kids these days, but I didn't care. The kitchen was chaos, cooks shouting, pans clanging. I scanned the supplies: flour, sugar, eggs, vanilla, some berries in the fridge. Not ideal, but I could work with it. I'd made cakes before, nothing this big, but I knew the drill. Tina poked her head in, grinning like she'd bet on me. "Kick-ass, Ash," she said, tossing me an apron. "Show that jerk what you've got." I started mixing batter, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind raced. This wasn't just about a cake, it was about proving I wasn't the nobody Frank thought I was. Every time I doubted myself, wondering if I'd crash and burn, I heard his voice. "Out of your league." It pissed me off enough to keep going. I whipped up a vanilla sponge, adding a touch of almond for depth, and prepped a buttercream frosting. The berries would be a filling, maybe a quick jam if I had time. I glanced at the clock, 90 minutes left. My stomach churned, but there was no backing out now. As I poured batter into pans, ignoring the sweat on my forehead, I thought about Brittany. Would she hate me for stepping in? Or would she get it? I didn't know, but I couldn't let her day fall apart. And Frank, he'd made this personal. If I pulled this off, he'd have to eat his words, smug grin and all. I slid the pans into the oven, praying they'd bake evenly, and started on the jam. The kitchen felt like a battlefield, but for the first time that day, I wasn't just clearing plates. I was fighting for myself. The kitchen was a war zone, cooks yelling over sizzling pans, waiters darting in and out, And me, Ashley Miller, standing at a cluttered counter with 90 minutes to save Brittany's wedding. No wedding cake. That was a disaster, especially with Frank out there, acting like he'd planned the perfect day. I'd promised the catering manager a 3-tier cake, and now staring at sacks of flour and a fridge with some berries I had to deliver. My hands shook as I grabbed a mixing bowl, but Frank's last jab, "You save Brittany's wedding," kept me moving. This wasn't just about a cake, it was about shutting him up for good. I started with the batter, cracking eggs and measuring sugar while the oven preheated. Vanilla sponge was the safest bet, simple but elegant if I nailed it. I added a splash of almond extract for depth, something I'd learned from a catering gig last year. The kitchen clock ticked like a bomb, and sweat beaded on my neck. I'd made cakes before, dozens for birthdays and small events, but never under this kind of pressure. Never with a room full of guests waiting or a stepfather betting on me to fail. I whisked the batter until it was smooth, ignoring the chaos around me, and poured it into 3 mismatched pans I'd scrounged from the supply rack. While the cakes baked, I tackled the frosting. Buttercream was my go-to, rich and forgiving. I grabbed butter from the cooler and started creaming it with powdered sugar, adding vanilla and a pinch of salt to cut the sweetness. The berries in the fridge, strawberries and raspberries, would make a quick jam for the filling. I tossed them into a pot with sugar and lemon juice, stirring over a burner while keeping an eye on the oven. The smell of baking sponge and simmering fruit filled the air, grounding me despite the nerves. I could do this. I had to. About 20 minutes in, while I was straining the jam, a woman in a sleek blazer poked her head into the kitchen. She had sharp eyes and a notepad, looking out of place among the sweaty cooks. "You the one making the cake?" she asked, her voice crisp but curious. I nodded, wiping my hands on my apron. "I'm Lydia Carson," she said, stepping closer. "Food critic. Heard the bakery flaked. What's your plan?" My stomach dropped. "A critic." "Here," I stammered, saying I was whipping up a vanilla cake with berry filling and buttercream. She raised an eyebrow, scribbling something down. "Ambitious for a last-minute fix. I'll be watching." She left before I could respond, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Lydia's visit rattled me, but it also lit a spark. If a food critic was watching, I couldn't half-ass this. I checked the cakes, golden and risen perfectly, and pulled them out to cool. The jam was ready, thick and tangy, so I set it aside and finished the buttercream, beating it until it was fluffy. Time was slipping, 45 minutes left. I started assembling, leveling the cakes with a knife and spreading jam between layers. The buttercream went on next, smooth, and even no crumbs in sight. I'd found some edible flowers in the fridge, white and delicate, so I saved them for decoration. It wasn't the fancy tiered masterpiece Brittany had ordered, but it was mine, and it was damn good. Tina ducked in her bartender vest, splattered with grenadine, and gave me a thumbs up. "You're killing it, Ash," she said, grabbing a spoon to taste the leftover jam. "This is gonna blow their minds." I laughed, nervous but grateful, and asked her to keep an eye on the dining room. "Is Frank still out there acting like a big shot?" I asked. She rolled her eyes. "Yup, telling everyone how his girl Brittany pulled off the perfect wedding." Her words stung, but they pushed me harder. This cake wasn't just for Brittany or the guests, it was for me to prove I wasn't the nobody Frank thought. With 10 minutes to spare, I finished the cake, stacking the tiers carefully and piping simple swirls around the edges. The edible flowers went on top, arranged in a loose crown that looked effortless, but took every ounce of focus I had. I stepped back, heart pounding, and took it in 3 tiers of vanilla sponge layered with ruby red jam and creamy frosting topped with flowers that caught the light. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. The catering manager burst in his face, less panicked now. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, grabbing the cart to wheel it out. "Let's do this," I said, my voice steady despite the butterflies. The banquet hall was buzzing, guests, laughing glasses, clinking music, humming in the background. I pushed the cart through the crowd, feeling every eye turn my way. The manager led me to the center table where Brittany and Greg sat surrounded by family. I caught Frank's face first, his smirk fading as he saw the cake. Brittany gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Greg leaned forward, grinning like a kid. The room went quiet, conversations trailing off as I stopped the cart and stepped back. The manager cleared his throat, announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen, the wedding cake courtesy of Ashley Miller." A ripple of murmurs spread, then applause, loud and warm. Guests stood craning to see the cake, some pulling out phones to snap pictures. Brittany jumped up, her dress swishing, and hugged me, whispering, "Ash, it's gorgeous." Greg clapped my shoulder, saying, "You saved the day." I managed a smile, my chest tight with relief, but my eyes locked on Frank. He stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his smug grin gone. For the first time, he had nothing to say. I felt a rush, part victory, part defiance, like I'd finally stepped out of his shadow. Lydia Carson wove through the crowd, her blazer catching the light. She stopped in front of the cake, studying it like a painting. "Impressive," she said, her voice carrying over the chatter. "Vanilla with almond notes, berry filling, and those flowers a bold choice under pressure. This isn't just a cake, it's a statement." The guests clapped again, louder now, and Lydia turned to me. "You're not a professional, are you?" she asked. I shook my head, admitting I was self-taught, just doing catering gigs. She smiled, handing me her card. "We'll talk later. Talent like this doesn't stay hidden." The room erupted, cheers mixing with applause as Brittany and Greg cut the first slice. Guests lined up, raving about the cake's flavor, the creamy frosting, the tart jam. A man in a suit, some friend of Greg's dad, asked if I did private events, slipping me his number. Another woman, maybe a local business owner, wanted to know my rates. I nodded, taking it all in, but my mind was spinning. I'd come here to clear plates, to be invisible. Now I was the one they couldn't stop talking about. Tina caught me by the bar, grinning ear to ear. "Told you you'd kick ass," she said, pouring me a mocktail. Frank's face. "Worth every second." I glanced over. He was by the dessert table talking to Mom, but stealing looks at me. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something sour, like he'd bitten into a lemon. Mom was watching too, her expression softer, almost proud, but she didn't come over. Brittany was back at her table laughing with Greg, but she kept glancing my way like she was seeing me for the first time. I should have been on top of the world, but a knot twisted in my gut. Frank wasn't done. I knew him too well. He'd hated being upstaged, and I'd just stolen his perfect little show. As the music picked up and guests started dancing, I saw him heading toward me, his face set like a storm cloud. I braced myself, knowing whatever came next wouldn't be pretty. He'd made this personal from the start, and now I'd turned his game against him. The fight wasn't over. The banquet hall buzzed with chatter as the last slice of my wedding cake disappeared from the dessert table. Guests were still raving, snapping photos of the 3-tier masterpiece I'd thrown together in 2 hours. I stood by the kitchen entrance, apron smeared with buttercream, watching people I didn't even know raise their glasses to Brittany and Greg. For a moment, I felt like I'd done something real, not just save the day, but proved I was more than Frank's cleanup girl. Then I saw him storming toward me, his face red and his jaw tight. Frank didn't look smug anymore. He looked pissed. He grabbed my arm, pulling me into a side room where the catering staff stored linens. "What the hell was that stunt?" he hissed, keeping his voice low so no one outside would hear. "You think you can hijack Brittany's wedding with your little cooking show?" His words hit hard, each one meant to cut me down like they always had. I yanked my arm free, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "I didn't hijack anything, Frank. There was no cake. Someone had to step up. I saved your precious wedding." He scoffed, leaning in close enough that I could smell his stale coffee breath. "Saved it? You made it about you always gotta be the center of attention, huh?" I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. For years, I'd swallowed his jabs, his sneers about my cooking, his praise for Brittany, while I sat there invisible. Not this time. "You're wrong," I said, locking eyes with him. You wanted me clearing plates to keep me small, but I'm not your punching bag. I'm a chef, and I just proved it to everyone out there. Frank's mouth twitched like he wanted to laugh but couldn't. Before he could fire back, the door swung open and Brittany stood there still in her wedding dress, her face a mix of confusion and something else I couldn't read. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between us. Frank straightened up, plastering on that fake smile he used for guests. "Nothing, honey, just telling Ashley she overstepped." Brittany frowned, her eyes landing on me. I braced myself, expecting her to side with him like always, but she stepped closer, her voice firm. "Overstepped, Frank. She saved my wedding. That cake was incredible, everyone's talking about it." Frank blinked, caught off guard. "It's your day, Brittany," he said, softer now. "She shouldn't be stealing your spotlight." Brittany shook her head, her veil catching the light. "She didn't steal anything, she made it better. You should be proud of her." I stood frozen, hardly believing what I'd heard. Brittany had never stood up for me, not like this. Frank's smile faltered, his control slipping, as Brittany's words hung in the air. Before I could say anything, Lydia Carson, the food critic who'd praised my cake, walked in, her sharp gray eyes scanning the room. "There you are, Ashley," she said, her tone warm but direct. "I've been looking for you." Frank's eyebrows shot up. He clearly knew who she was. Lydia didn't even glance at him, she focused on me. That cake was extraordinary, perfectly balanced flavors, flawless execution. "I run a restaurant group in New York. We're opening a new spot in Manhattan, fine dining, modern American. I want you on the team." My jaw dropped. I couldn't speak for a second. "New York. A real restaurant. I'm just starting out," I stammered, feeling the weight of her offer. Lydia smiled, handing me a business card. "You're not just anything. Call me next week. We'll talk details." She turned to Brittany, nodding approvingly. "Your sister's got serious talent. You must be proud." Brittany nodded, her eyes soft. "I am." Frank stood there silent for once, like he'd been punched in the gut. Lydia left, and I slipped the card into my pocket, my hands shaking. The door hadn't even closed when another guest approached, a guy in a tailored suit who introduced himself as Tom Delaney, owner of a local bistro called The Rustic Spoon. "Heard about your cake?" he said, shaking my hand. "I need a new pastry chef, someone with your creativity. You free to meet next week?" I nodded, still reeling, mumbling something about my schedule. As he walked away, I caught Mom standing by the doorway, watching quietly. She hadn't said a word during the whole exchange, but her eyes weren't avoiding me anymore. She stepped forward, her voice low. "Ashley, that was really something. I didn't know you could do that." It wasn't much, but from Mom it was huge. Frank cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Well," he said, forcing a chuckle, "guess you got lucky out there, kid." I looked at him, seeing the cracks in his usual swagger. "It wasn't luck," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "It was me doing what I'm good at." He didn't respond, just adjusted his tie and walked out, muttering about checking on the guests. Brittany touched my arm, her smile small but real. "I meant what I said, Ash. That cake, it was amazing. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. For the first time, I felt like she saw me not just as her kid sister, but as someone who mattered. The rest of the reception was a blur. Guests kept coming up, asking about the cake, complimenting the flavors. A woman who ran a catering company slipped me her card, saying she'd love to collaborate. Greg found me by the bar, grinning as he clapped me on the shoulder. "You killed it, Ashley. Brittany's over the moon about that cake." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't expected. Even the catering manager who doubted me gave me a nod, saying, "You pulled off a miracle, kid." I didn't feel like a kid anymore. As the night wound down, I stepped outside for air, leaning against the patio railing. The stars were out bright against the Ohio sky, and I let myself breathe. I'd walked into this wedding expecting to be invisible, hauling plates while Frank lorded over everything. Instead, I'd turned it around, not just for Brittany's day, but for me. Lydia's card burned a hole in my pocket. New York felt like a dream, but it was real. Mom's words echoed too tentative but honest. And Brittany, she'd stood up for me, something I never thought I'd see. I wasn't naive. Frank wouldn't change overnight. He'd probably spin this to his buddies, act like he'd always known I had potential. But it didn't matter. I'd seen what I could do, what I was worth, and no one could take that away. The question now wasn't whether I could make it as a chef. It was where I'd go next, and what I'd do with the chance I'd fought for. 3 weeks after Brittany's wedding, I stood in my tiny Columbus apartment boxes, packed and labeled, ready to leave Ohio behind. Lydia Carson's business card sat on my kitchen counter, worn from how many times I'd held it. Her offer wasn't just a job, it was a ticket to New York, a chance to work in a real kitchen, to be a chef, not the girl Frank Sullivan thought belonged in the dish pit. I'd called her the Monday after the wedding, my hands shaking as I dialed. "We start training in a month," she'd said, her voice crisp but kind. "Be ready to work hard, Ashley." I was ready, more than I'd ever been. Leaving wasn't easy. Columbus was all I'd known, my dad's old house, the diner where Tina and I grabbed late-night fries, the community college where I'd taken my first culinary class. But staying meant living under Frank's shadow, his sneers, and his rules. I couldn't do it anymore. The wedding had changed me, not just because of the cake or Lydia's offer, but because I'd finally seen my own worth. Frank could call it a stunt all he wanted. I knew what I'd done. I'd turned his attempt to humiliate me into the moment that set me free. Frank didn't take it well. A few days after the wedding, he cornered me at Mom's house, where I'd stopped to drop off some borrowed cookware. He was in his usual spot, sprawled in his recliner, a beer in hand, but his grin was gone. "Heard you're running off to New York?" he said, his tone half mocking, half bitter. "Think you're a big shot now." I set the pans on the counter, keeping my back straight. "I'm not running, Frank. I'm starting my life, something you never thought I could do." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Don't get cocky, kid. You got lucky with that cake. Real world's gonna chew you up." I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who needed to put me down to feel big. "Maybe," I said. "But that's my call, not yours." He tried to spin it later, bragging to his golf buddies about my stepdaughter, the chef, like he'd been in my corner all along. I heard about it from Mom, who mentioned it over coffee one morning, her voice hesitant. "Frank's proud in his way," she said, stirring her mug. I didn't buy it. Frank wasn't proud. He was scrambling to save face after I'd proved him wrong. I let it go, nodding to keep the peace. Mom was trying, and that was something. Before I left her house that day, she pulled out a worn leather notebook, yellowed pages filled with handwritten recipes. "These were your grandma's," she said, pressing it into my hands. "She loved cooking like you. You remind me of her, Ashley." Her eyes were soft, almost teary, and I hugged her, feeling a warmth I hadn't in years. Brittany was different too. She and Greg were back from their honeymoon, a week in Hawaii, when she called me out of the blue. "Can we meet?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. We grabbed lunch at a taco place near her office, her in a blazer, me in my beat-up sneakers. She didn't beat around the bush. "I'm sorry, Ash," she said, pushing her plate aside. "I didn't see how Frank treated you, how I let it happen. I was too wrapped up in my own stuff." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to brush it off, but her words hit deep. "You stood up for me at the wedding," I said finally. "That meant a lot." She smiled, a real smile, not the polite one she used to give. "You're my sister. I want us to be better." We made a deal: weekly calls, no matter how busy life got. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Tina threw me a going-away party at her bar, a dive joint with sticky floors and killer wings. She mixed me a mocktail, calling it the Ashley Special, and toasted to my new life. "You're gonna own New York," she said, her grin wide. "And if Frank shows up, I'll pour dishwater in his beer." I laughed, picturing it, and hugged her tight. Tina had been my rock, pushing me to fight when I wanted to quit. I promised to fly her out once I got settled, Maybe show her a real Manhattan kitchen. The day I left, Mom and Brittany drove me to the airport. Frank didn't come, said he had a work thing, but I knew better. It was fine. I didn't need his goodbye. Mom held my hand at the gate, her grip tighter than usual. "You'll do great," she said, her voice catching. Brittany handed me a small gift, a keychain shaped like a chef's hat. "For luck," she said, and we hugged until the boarding call crackled over the speakers. As I walked to the plane, my carry-on bouncing behind me, I felt lighter than I had in years. New York was a whirlwind. I moved into a shoebox apartment in Brooklyn, shared with 2 roommates who ate my leftovers, and started training at Lydia's restaurant, the Saffron Room. The kitchen was intense, chefs barking orders, plates flying, but I loved it. Every dish was a chance to prove myself, to show I belonged. Lydia was tough but fair, pulling me aside one night to say my berry tart had promise. It wasn't a rave, but from her, it was gold. I kept Grandma's notebook on my nightstand, flipping through it when I needed a boost. Her scrawled recipe for lemon pound cake inspired my first menu item, a modern twist that got nods from the sous chef. A month in, I got a call from Brittany. She and Greg were visiting New York for a weekend. We met at a diner near Times Square, her laughing when I ordered a burger after weeks of fancy plates. She told me Frank was still talking about my big break, trying to take credit with his buddies. I rolled my eyes, but it didn't sting anymore. He could talk all he wanted. I was building something real. Brittany showed me pictures from the wedding, my cake front and center in half of them. "You made my day, Ash," she said, her voice soft. I smiled, feeling the gap between us shrink a little more. Looking back, that wedding wasn't just Brittany's, it was the day I stopped letting Frank define me. I'd walked in expecting to be invisible, hauling plates while he played king. Instead, I'd turned his game against him, not out of spite, but because I knew who I was. Cooking wasn't a hobby or a kid's project. It was my life. I didn't need Frank's approval or anyone's to keep going. I'd fought for my place and won. If you've ever had to stand up for what you love against someone who tried to shut you down, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. Your fight matters, and so do you.